Hi guys, thank you very much for joining me. My name is Tom and I'm the Tech Chap, and in this video we're going to have a look at the iPad Air 2 versus the brand new iPad Pro. We're going to look at the specs, the pros and cons, the price differences, see if there's any speed difference, so we'll run some app loading tests and some benchmarks, just to generally get a feel of which one's better, which one maybe you should buy if you're in the market for a new tablet, and overall perhaps whether the iPad Pro is a good upgrade, whether it's a standalone device, and how these two compare overall. On the iPad Air 2, we have a 9.7-inch display, which is a PPI of 264. That's the same as the iPad Pro, but we'll go on to that in just a second. Inside, we have an A8X processor alongside 2 GB of RAM. You can buy this in 16, the base model, which I wouldn't recommend, 64 or 128 GB options for storage. It's 6.1mm thin and 437 grams, that's 0.96 pounds. So very light, very portable, very comfortable to hold one-handed. This isn't really a big step up over the original Air. It's a little bit faster, a little bit thinner, a tiny bit lighter, but the difference between the Air and the Air 2, which actually I have here for notes, as you can see, wasn't actually that much of a difference. The screen was slightly nicer, there was a better coating, and as I say, it was slightly faster and a little bit thinner and lighter. Generally though, we haven't seen a huge improvement from since the original Air, so obviously the Pro is a big step up in size, in power, and performance, so it'll be interesting to see what the difference is. Now, as I say, this is 9.7 inches, here we have 12.9, so 3-inch step up, and that actually translates to a real-world screen difference of nearly 78%. The Pro, which you can see I'm struggling to get within the camera frame here, is 78% larger screen real estate. What that means is basically we almost have 2 iPad Air screens in the size of this one if you get rid of the bezels. Obviously the biggest difference aside from the difference in display size is the weight, is the portability issues. The iPad Pro is 0.06 millimeters thicker than the iPad Air 2. Not a big difference again. The biggest difference, of course, is the weight. This is 713 grams, 1.57 pounds. That's, as I say, up from 437 on the iPad Air 2. So nearly 300 grams heavier. Do you feel it? Yes, but as I said in my other videos about the iPad Pro, surprisingly, given the size of this, you expect it to weigh a lot more than it does. This weighs about 30 grams more than the original iPad, so it's still very, very light for something this size. But obviously when you put this down and you go back to the Air 2, you do feel that this is instantly a lot more portable. You wouldn't feel this in a backpack, you probably would just about feel that. But obviously you are getting a lot of advantages with the iPad Pro, which we'll run through in just a second. So yeah, definitely a lot more portable. The iPad Air 2, you're probably more comfortable using this on a plane, on a train, although the Pro, while being heavier, while being a bit thicker, the thickness doesn't really make much of a difference, I don't think. It's still obviously smaller in terms of screen size, in terms of overall size, than a 13.3-inch laptop, and a lot of people do use 13.3-inch laptops, me included, on planes and trains. So if that, if you can use a laptop of that size on a commute or a public transport, then of course you can use the iPad Pro, but you probably will get a few more looks. So let's put them side by side and see if we can actually see the difference in the thickness. So as you can see, there really isn't much of a difference in the thickness. 0.6 mils. It's not going to you're not going to notice it every day. Only when you put them side by side will you really notice that. So it's impressively thin, even though obviously it is a little bit thicker. They both have the exact same 8 megapixel rear iSight camera with the same 1.2 megapixel FaceTime camera. Same specs, same megapixels, same maximum 1080p 30 resolution for video. So no improvement in terms of the camera. So I still wouldn't recommend people using their iPads to take pictures. Obviously those who do, I'll have a quiet word with you afterwards, but you will look a little bit ridiculous using the iPad Pro to do that, I think. Before we talk about the speed and the performance difference, let's have a quick look at the speakers. That's something that's been significantly upgraded in the iPad Pro. On the Air 2, as you can see, we've got 2 cutouts here for the speakers at the bottom of the device, whereas on the Pro, this has been significantly upgraded. We have 4 speakers, 2 on the bottom, 2 on the top, which apparently does use software that optimizes the speaker quality depending on how you use it in whatever angle and orientation. So I'll show you how much better the Pro is in terms of sound quality by putting some music on both. So I'm not going to speak over this part. I'll aim the mic directly at these iPads and I'll make sure they have the same volumes. If we go from 5 from the top, like so on that one, and again on this one, it's obviously a bit more cumbersome to hold. 5 from the top. So same volume, mics pointed equally in the same direction, and we'll play a few seconds of a couple of songs to see which sounds better. So here we go. iPad Air 2 first. So both sound very good. Let's find another example. Let's jump to, say, a trailer, see if that sounds different than a song. So I've got the Star Wars trailer lined up here. I'm going to play about 20 seconds from each of them. I'll pause the iPad Air and then I'll go to the iPad Pro and we'll compare them side by side. So let's see how they sound.
But I've got nothing to fight for. But I've got nothing to fight for.
Nothing will stand in our way. Nothing will stand in our way. I will finish what you started. I will finish what you started.
There were stories about what happened. There were stories about what happened.
So as you can see, perhaps this video doesn't come across quite how well the iPad Pro sounds in terms of bass. If you put your fingers on the speakers while it's playing quite loudly, you can really feel the vibration, the resonance of it. The bass is very impressive. So we'll continue this one more time with the same trailer. We'll whack the volume up to perhaps 1 from top, and I'll put them into sort of viewing landscape mode, so you can see the difference between the letterboxing, which obviously will be the same because they're both 4x3, but you'll see how much extra space you get on the Pro versus the Air. So let's turn these into landscape mode and we'll finish the trailer.
All of it. The dark side. All of it. The dark side.
The Pro sounded so much better there. There's so much more bass and depth to it. Also a lot louder in terms of volume. So the next job is to talk about the power, the speed, the performance. So we'll start with a synthetic benchmark. I'm going to run the Antutu benchmark on both of these at the same time, and we'll see sort of what artificially, synthetically, if you will, the difference between the Pro with its A9X and 4GB of RAM, and the Air 2 with its 2GB of RAM and A8X chip. We'll see on paper what the difference is. And there we have it. As you can see, there's not actually a big difference. We've got 63,391 on the Pro and 60,481 on the Air 2. Now bear in mind that the iPad Pro is running a high resolution, so it's going to have to push more pixels, and that's part of the reason it needs the A9X. It's not going to be like for like, much more powerful necessarily than the Air 2. As you can see here, the difference in this one benchmark really isn't that significant at all. It's what, about 4% or something, and that's kind of within the margin of error of these benchmarks anyway. So as you can see, you've got actually 2 gigs here, you've got 4 gigs here, that confirms it. This is a 64 gig model with 57 available. This is the 32 with 27 available. So you can see that the RAM is making a big difference here. The multitask user experience is significantly higher on the Pro. That's probably down to the 4 gigs of RAM. The OC is pretty much the same. Let's look at the CPU. CPU, that's a bit strange, is significantly higher on the iPad Air. That doesn't really sound right. Perhaps it's a bit of a bug, or and that probably will influence the score as well. If we look at the RAM, about the same there in terms of actual speed. That's not talking quantity. And graphics, again, pretty similar. So I'm not overly convinced by this one benchmark. It is obviously saying it's a little bit faster here, the Pro, but I think it should be a little bit faster than that in reality, given the difference between the A8X, A9X, 2 and 4 GB of RAM. So next job is to do a boot test, and when we wake it up from that, we'll do a few apps and see which one opens those quicker. So let's turn these off and then boot them back up. So let's turn these on at the same time. 1, 2, 3. iPad Pro is done. Air 2 not too far behind, but definitely a win by the Pro. So we've got no background apps running. It's been a fresh restart. They're both running the latest iOS 9.1, so let's see which ones open up apps a bit quicker. Let's start with something a bit more intensive. Let's start with Asphalt 8. As you can see, the Pro loaded that up a lot faster. Definite big win for the Pro there with that fairly intensive game. Let's give iMovie a go. 1, 2, 3. Pretty much the same there. Not a very intensive app, but basically the same load time. So it's a draw, I'd say. Quite a bit faster there by the iPad Pro. Definitely loaded that quicker. Let's try another one. Clock. Pretty much the same. Notes. Again, almost the same. So you can see these, the lightweight Apple apps really aren't making a big difference in the speed there. But let's give YouTube a go. 1, 2, 3. The Air 2 won there, but I'm not convinced that's not just because of it had sort of access to the internet before. Let's try it again. 1, 2, 3. Well, no, it's done it again, so let's see if we can make it a third time. I am pressing them at exactly the same time. So let's try YouTube. 1, 2, 3. And again, 3 times in a row, so that's repeatable. So the Air 2 does, for some reason, load up YouTube slightly faster. So as you can see, there's really not a big difference. I'll play Asphalt 8 on both devices so you can see perhaps the frame rate difference between the two of them. This video you're watching is only at 30 frames per second, so you're not going to see a big difference, but I can tell you what I see. But they should obviously both play very well. They're both extremely fast. One thing I'm noticing is the sound very much is coming from one direction. I can easily cover it as well with my hand. It's easily mutable as I'm holding it in landscape mode. So that's definitely something not so good with the Air 2, or in fact any of the iPads thus far except for the new Pro. So, but as you can see, this plays perfectly well. It's very fast. As you'd expect, really, this is still a very high-end tablet. This really doesn't. The Pro doesn't really replace the Air 2. There's been no replacement, in fact, for the Air 2 this year. Hopefully next year we'll get the Air 3. I'm trying on the Pro, which is a much better sort of gaming experience. It's a lot more immersive. And you don't have to obviously worry about the letterboxing you get with some of the video content. This is obviously taking up the full 12.9-inch display, and the speakers as well. It means I can't easily muffle it because they're in the corners, all 4 corners, so that's a lot better. So let's get the volume up a little bit and play Asphalt 8 on the iPad Pro. In terms of frame rate and stability, I'm not really seeing any difference. This, to me, does look a lot nicer simply because it's a lot bigger, it's a lot more immersive. But in terms of graphical fidelity, quality, frame rate, I'm not noticing a difference at all between the Air 2 and the iPad Pros. So surprisingly, performance really isn't that much of an improvement on the Pro over the Air 2, which is a bit of a surprise given how much better on paper at least the specs are. So one of the key things with iOS 9.1 and available on the iPad Air 2 and the Pro, but most sort of marketed, most sold on the idea for on the Pro, is multitasking. So obviously both these can do it, but the Pro with its larger screen is much more at home with multitasking, with split view and side view. So if you swipe in from the left, you have the column view, the slide view, which you can see you can choose a selection of apps to have in this little view here. Straight away you can see the size difference. If we open up the same app on both, let's go for the clock for example, we can obviously drag them both have the same level of multitasking as each other, but obviously the benefit of the Pro is it's a lot larger. You could get two almost full Air displays here. In fact, I'll show you that if I put that on here. You have to imagine minus the bezels. It's sort of almost an Air display per half of the Pro, so a lot more space to get work done, to get office work done, to check emails and things. But you can see that the Air 2 still does hold its own. It has essentially the same functionality, just a bit smaller, which obviously comes with the added portability. There's no real difference here. We can change these apps up a little bit. Safari. So let's go to, let's check out the tech chat on both. So, both work perfectly fine. You can have 2 apps side by side on the Air 2. They work well. It's big enough really to check your emails, to check news and websites and browse. And perhaps I wouldn't suggest doing a lot of work on the Air 2. You're not going to have a lot of room for your Word or your Page or your Office document next to it, or your Excel spreadsheet, for example. The Pro really is a Pro version. It's in the name, really. The other benefit of obviously being having a bigger screen for the multitasking benefit is we get the Smart Connect dock, as you can see here. This allows it to connect to a smart keyboard, which you can buy as an accessory for the iPad Pro. You can, of course, get keyboard accessories for the Air 2, which connect via Bluetooth, which have their own merits and perhaps are a little bit cheaper as well. And there's also more of them. But Apple's own keyboard you can get for the Pro. So docking it means you can get a full-size keyboard. Obviously, you do get a bigger keyboard because it can stretch the full width of the larger Pro, which means you get a full quality keyboard with the accessory, which means you can do a lot more work, proper office work, productivity, get some writing done, get some work done. So in terms of accessories, as well as the Smart Connect for the keyboard, you also get the Apple Pencil for the iPad Pro. I haven't got one with me, unfortunately. It is still waiting to be dispatched from Apple, about 2 to 3 weeks, annoyingly. So I can't demonstrate that for you. There's a new sort of multi-touch technology within the display on the Pro, which the Air 2 doesn't have, which allows it to use the pencil, and it can sense the orientation, the pressure, the sensitivity of the press of the pencil on the iPad Pro, so you can make notes, sketch, paint, for example. With the combination of accessories and a larger screen, which is a bit more beneficial, a bit more useful for the multitasking. Certainly the Pro is nicer to use for work as well as play in terms of gaming. Fundamentally, the Air 2 does everything the same. It really doesn't offer anything uniquely different, except for the pencil that you can't get with the Air. And again, you can get other styluses, particularly papers, for example, the Paper 53 stylus, which works with their app. So not really a big difference in functionality and basic usefulness. It's just bigger, larger, easier to use for multitasking, a bit better at productivity perhaps, but again, you do get the compromise of the size, the weight, and the portability. Battery life is also the same as Apple say. They both get about 10 hours. The Pro does have a significantly bigger battery with a 10,307 milliamp hour battery versus a 7,340 milliamp hour battery on the Air 2. So a much bigger battery, but of course much bigger screen to power. So actually Apple have done well despite the added screen size, despite the higher res and the more powerful chips inside. It does have the same 10-hour stated battery life, and I found that in my experience they both do last pretty much exactly the same amount of time, so that's very good news. So finally, in terms of price, the Air starts at £399, which is $499 for the 16 gig model. As I always say, if you've watched my channel before, I'd never opt for the 16 gig model on phones or tablets. It really isn't enough with HD video and apps getting big all the time. You can also get it in the 64 and 128 gigabyte models, and also with Cell. So starting, as I say, at £399 or $499. The Pro starts at £679 or $799. That's for the 32 gig one. There's no 16 base here. You're going to go straight into the 32, which is a lot better. I'm pleased they did that. But of course, that means we can't really compare the prices directly, because this is a base model of 16. This is a base of 32. So the only one that we can compare is prices at 128 gigabytes. They're both offered in 128 gigabyte Wi-Fi. So what's the difference? The Air 2 for the 128 gigabyte model is £559 or $699. This is £799 or $949. So the difference, assuming we compare them with the same storage, is about $250, £240. So quite a big difference between them for not a huge step up in performance. The main difference is, as we've seen, is the speakers, is the extra screen real estate for productivity, for gaming, for video consumption, for media consumption generally. It's just a better iPad. There's sort of more iPad, as Apple say themselves. It's even more iPad. Obviously, you are compromising portability, and it's a little bit heavier. Obviously, the thickness difference doesn't really make much of a big difference in the real world. But I think really it comes down to which one should you buy. It's going to be what you use it for. If this mainly stays at home, it's in your lounge, your living room, your bedroom, and you just sort of pick it up now and then to watch things on it, I think the Pro might be quite a bit nicer. It does offer a much better viewing experience, much better, more immersive gaming experience, and apps and websites all look a lot better to use. But then again, if you're taking it on a train, if it's in a backpack a lot, if you're commuting with it, if it's taking it to out and about, then the Air 2, you'll really value the portability, and of course it is cheaper, so it's going to come down to what you want it for. They're both excellent tablets, both very, very fast. Neither really offer anything overly unique, as I say, except for the pencil, but then you can get other styluses. And in fact, you may not be interested in the $99 pencil, which is quite expensive, of course, for a pencil. So yeah, which one you should buy? Personally, if I didn't have either, I would buy the Pro, because I think it's more powerful, it's slightly more future-proofed. It doesn't have Force Touch, unfortunately. Maybe the next year's model will. But I think for someone who just uses it, as I say, around about the house, use it for a media consumption device, I do appreciate the bigger screen. If I already had an Air 2, which I could do as you can see here, would I upgrade? No, I wouldn't, unless I was a real fan of watching things on it, of reading things on it all the time, and it was like my main device. It was a big deal for me. I wouldn't necessarily say it was the upgrade. It was worth it. So if you don't have either, I'd opt for the Pro, unless you do value portability. If you have an Air 2, not really worth the upgrade, unless you do obviously just want a bigger screen, a bigger iPad, which of course some people do. So this has been my comparison between the iPad Air 2 and the iPad Pro. I hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you very much for watching. I know it's been a bit of a long one, but I hope you've found it useful. Thank you very much for watching, guys, and please do like and subscribe, and I'll catch you again on the Tech Chat. Cheers.